Hey, it's Patty, and in this one, I'm going to talk about nutritional considerations with hypermobility spectrum disorder and EDS. And spoiler alert, I have none and will also provide you with a lot. I feel like that's how a lot of medical care is, right? Um, we don't necessarily treat diagnoses if we want the best long-term outcomes, but we treat diagnoses when we're talking about symptomatic relief, and it's really the same conversation with nutrition. I think there's a lot of pull right now, or at least information that's out there, that if you do all of the things for everything, that you'll start to feel better. And that's actually not what it is for most people. We actually want to know what's happening in some body to treat that body. And that doesn't mean that if you have EDS, you have to do the 50 million things that might pop up if you have it. But I'm going to go through what we know about food, what we know about the conditions, so that people have better ideas. But like I said, spoiler alert, this nobody should be given a protocol to follow unless they are working on it with an individual to extrapolate the information of being on that protocol and modifying as you go. All right, everything should be individualized and it really depends on your presentation and what your body is going through. I'm a firm believer that food is medicine, but if we're not listening to the patient's story and we're just saying, you have EDS, you should be on this, it's no longer medicine. It's just throwing spaghetti at a wall, right? Hoping something will stick. So again, I'm going to go over all of the things, but please understand that nutrition is absolutely unique to the individual. Yep, spoiled it already. There's no perfect diet approach for an individual, whether we're talking about EDS or anything else. So there's so many things that go into it, right? Diets and protocols will consider the diagnosis, not the complexity of an individual, where they live, what they have access to, their finances. There's so many things that go into this. But what that also means too is that we might have more options, right? It might not be the three protocols that we've heard of. Hey, maybe there's actually other, like more simple things or other places to start that sound safer for where our body is right now. So the really important question is, and this you can ask this over and over, right? Because the body shifts and it changes and it's responding to different things. So what are the benefits you're looking to get out of your food choices now? What are you dealing with now, and how can food help you? That is the question, right? Because different types of food are going to do different things in the body for different conditions in different people. Okay, so I think food is wonderful to use, but again, either you are an expert and you are figuring this out, or you are sitting down with an expert. Also, to say, many of us experts have a very difficult time figuring out our own health. And people in general, there is some sort of wall that forces us to bond with community in some way. So we tend to have blinders, whether it's our own health, family's health. So I will say, don't feel like if you should know this information, that you should do it yourself. I think it always is very helpful to talk to somebody when it doesn't seem to be working and getting opinions, feedback, and suggestions, right? So let's look at food in another way. Let's look at food as medicine, right? Let food be thy medicine. I think that there's a lot of programs out there, and for a very long time, it was very focused around elimination diets, right? That to me has a very negative context, especially in the individuals that I see a lot that are already eliminating foods because they don't know it's safe or they react to certain things. So taking more things out for some people isn't necessarily the place to start. So another way to look at it is, are there any foods that can be used positively to influence that individual's health? So if we can, we want to look beyond eliminating and avoiding first, seeing if we can clean things up, add positive things in, and then regroup. I think we find it so much easier to make positive changes first and then go back in and be a little bit more picky. It gives you a little bit of confidence over your body and food too. So when we think about issues with the tissues, right, connective tissue is found everywhere in the body, including the gastrointestinal system, right, especially the lining and barrier systems. So think about permeability, leaky gut, and things like that. That stuff, that lining that's supposed to be keeping things out protectively, is made out of connective tissue. So if you have less efficiency in your connective tissue, you may have, that's always the thing, right? Everybody's different. you may have less efficiency at keeping things out of, or keeping things from passing the barrier that are not supposed to. And sometimes they do. And that's other things as well, not just our connective tissue problems, but you add inflammation to connective tissue problems and it increases the permeability. So that's why it's not always just the connective tissue's fault. There's usually altered connective tissue and bacterial overgrowth, or connective tissue and parasites, connective tissue and just not eating the best foods for that individual. So those are all the things that we can work on, right? Having a connective tissue disorder can mean that there's a decreased efficiency of the function of the connective tissue itself. So that's what I was just describing, okay? Then considering impaired efficiency, you shouldn't challenge the gut more than needed, right? And this is where if we're gonna talk to anybody about food, then we need to have a talk with what is available and accessible currently on the market and easy to get versus what should we be putting into our bodies, right? So if we have barrier systems that don't respond well to inflammation, toxins, things that aren't supposed to go in there, then we really need to talk about healthy diet first. And healthy diet actually just starts with real food. Is there a lot of processed food in the diet? Is there a lot of things that we want to consider natural products? That's where we actually want to start. Again, we start with cleaning things up before we take things out. Okay, so we can decrease processed foods. We're going to eat well and balance for that individual's needs. That's why hearing the story is really important. And then avoiding personal sensitivities too. And combining all of these can be really difficult, especially the personal sensitivities if somebody can't figure out what it is. So that's why we have to work with an individual to bounce ideas off of them so that we can figure out how to stabilize our health. Okay. So when we're talking about motility issues aren't necessarily a nutritional relate, like directly nutritional relate. It's not necessarily the food that's going in there that's the problem. So motility issues, whether it's too fast or too slow, and we see both in this population, it's not all too slow, and it can go back and forth, and the top half of the gut can be too fast, the lower part too slow, and vice versa. It's usually vice versa that we see. But motility issues specifically is related to the neurological system. So your autonomic nervous system actually regulates gut motility. So that's why it'd be really great if we had more neurogastroenterologists out there, because treating the gut locally for a gut motility problem is not going to have long-term benefits, right? So we have to work on the neurological system in conjunction with working on the gut, all right? There are a lot of things that can be helped with when somebody has gut motility issues with diet and nutrition, but long-term management will have to address the neurological system. Okay, so you need to reduce neurological inflammation and you need to reduce the stress that's placed on the motility of the GI system, which is where we can bring in nutrition and just healthy choices for that individual. Okay, so when we talk about dysautonomia, all right, or dumping syndrome or whatever it might be, the motility problem, right? How do we help motility problems? So the recommendations that we have for those with dysautonomia, especially for dumping syndrome. So dumping syndrome is where somebody eats food and it sits in the stomach and it sits and it sits and it sits, right? And all of a sudden the body goes, oh, I forgot to move you to the small intestine, and it goes plop, and this giant food bolus moves down to this little small intestine tube from the big pouch of a stomach, which the small intestine is not made to stretch like that, but it dumps it all into that tube and it stretches the tissue. Now that tissue, as I said, is innervated by the autonomic nervous system and it's on a feedback loop. So the directions go, the communication goes both ways. So as the small intestine has this expansion to it, the small intestine goes, oh my God, help me. It starts to panic, it sends out signals, and then the brain responds with a dysautonomia episode in trying to basically send all of its resources down to the gut because it has to save you, because your small intestine needs help. So you can end up with a dysautonomia event called dumping syndrome. So a dysautonomia flare caused by things dumping into the small intestine too quickly. And that stems from an overlying motility issue in general, because what we should be having in the gut is this rhythmical peristalsis, this whoosh, 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 that pushes small chunks of food through from the stomach to the small intestine, through the small intestine. So you go duodenum, and then through to the other pieces. So if we don't have that rhythmical movement that's happening, and you have a sit, 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 dump, you have an underlying motility issue that's created this dumping problem, right? So you have to work on the motility issue. So it's neurological. You've got to work on that piece, the autonomic nervous system, and retrain it to fire the appropriate signals out, right? It's got to learn how to strengthen the rest and digest, that vagus, that ventral vagus system. So that's neurology, but let's talk again. I always get distracted with neurology, don't I? We are on diet and nutrition. So the recommendations, especially if you have dumping syndrome, is to eat smaller, more frequent meals. So maybe we can make the bolus of food smaller, but we are not restricting calories, right? So this is where we want to work with a professional. Hey, I'm having problems getting food through my gut. Tell me the good things that I can put in my smaller meals that will help me stay up with vitamins and minerals and things like that, and keep my caloric content what it needs to be, because we don't want to reduce intake for most individuals. We just want to work on this motility issue. Okay. Lower glycemic index options with meals. So that's really limiting processed sugars, the type of carbohydrates that you eat, so that it's not as quickly digested and broken down, can actually help with motility issues. And that's something to talk about with a provider. What are the appropriate things? What's glycemic index? Which one should I be focusing on? Talk to a provider. Increase healthy, nutritious fats and proteins. So fats and proteins, again, can be something that slows things down, so it's not trying to rapidly push things through the gut, right? And this is different for everybody, because some people have difficulty breaking down proteins, but if you don't seem to have a problem with that, then healthy fats and proteins could be something more beneficial for the diet. And also increasing dietary fiber. So this sounds very counterintuitive, what we're saying, but however, this is based on the modern American diet, right? Or the standard American diet, the SAD diet. And that's typically filled with a lot of processed foods. It's filled with grains and things that we don't necessarily need as much. So while this looks like, wait, this is all contraindicating itself. It's, it tells me to eat fat, but then it tells me to eat fiber. Actually, it's more of like the Mediterranean diet type of approach, right? Like, let's get healthy fats and proteins in. We're going to limit grains, and we're going to make sure that we have healthy fibers. So that's what it's trying to say there, right? Increasing the viscosity or the thickness of the food might actually help with the motility and the movement. And I'm going to skip down from that bullet, because talking about the viscosity and the thickness of food, also when we're talking about water content, I'm not saying to limit your water intake during the day, but when we're talking about having water around meals, then if you can limit water drinking or liquid drinking 30 minutes before and after meals, it's going to limit the stretch or the food bolus volume, if you're putting food in there as well. So basically, we just have to, if the stomach and small intestine don't like to stretch, then we're going to have to figure out a way to be sneaky, or to not stretch it as big, but maybe little stretches more often, right? So we don't necessarily want to add water to that volume that's going in too. Eliminating dairy and milk products might be helpful for some. That really is kind of like an inflammatory type of response, right? And if you already have dairy type of reactions, then please don't put that into your gut. It's not going to help your motility. One of my favorites for the dumping syndrome, again, if it's a dysautonomia type of problem. So if you have a motility problem, it means that your autonomic nervous system is probably not as strong as it should be and as balanced as it should be. So we're going to have to reteach it when it turns on, when it turns off, what system it's supposed to be on. So lying down and elevating your legs for 30 minutes after meals, it says to improve blood flow of the gut. Yes, it does do this. However, when you lie down, you also remind your body, hey, it's parasympathetic time. This is digestion time. We've got this. So it's exercising and reteaching and retraining. That's what I always come back to, right? Like, you have to retrain your neurological system to work like a muscle. We have to retrain it, re-strengthen it. So when you lie down, you're retraining it. Nope, we're totally safe. Remember, you're just supposed to be digesting food. I'll lie down to convince you. But doing that for 30 minutes can actually help stimulate the autonomics to respond more appropriately. Okay. Increasing salt and water intake outside of mealtime, right? Because we don't want to take it right before or after. But just working on dysautonomia. Sorry, that little paragraph is actually from the book, the Taming the Zebra book that that was co-author on. So there is a chapter 16 on dysautonomia. But that's really just stabilizing the autonomic nervous system with some of those superficial methods. Checking vitamin B12 deficiencies, maybe supplementation can be helpful, and then decreasing histamine load if there appears to be a sensitivity. We want to keep inflammation out of the gut, right? That can feed into motility problems and that reaction of the autonomic nervous system when fibers do stretch. It's not going to respond well if it's stretching irritated tissue, right? So those are the recommendations for dysautonomia, especially dumping. And then we can consider bacterial issues. So if you have slowed motility, if you don't have this peristalsis that's happening and that's pushing food through at the speed that it should be pushing through, if you consider water movement, so like rivers versus ponds, rivers as they're flowing through, there's not really the opportunity for things to sit and to build. But if you have a pond, then you have all the time for this bacterial growth to happen on top of each other, and you end up with like the scum on the pond, which is what happens when there isn't a lot of motility and movement. You have a prime environment for bacteria to build up if it's not moving through efficiently, right? So motility issues typically come with small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And I know there's a lot of in the Western medicine world, there's a lot of use of antibiotics, right? But if we understand that the connective tissue disorder might come with an altered autonomic nervous system that we haven't fixed long term yet, and hopefully we'll learn with our providers, right? And we have repeated bouts of motility problems because we haven't gotten it under control yet, neurology, then we're going to have repeated bouts of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So for those people that seem to have more motility issues, I would say please make sure that you talk to possibly a more holistic provider about other things that can be helpful for bacterial control. Diets can certainly help that. Looking into other inflammatory issues that can increase bacterial concentrations. So systemic inflammatory responses, viruses, toxins, actually physical or mental stress, traumas can actually increase inflammatory responses, including in the gut as well. So working on all of those things, this is the long-term management strategy for bacteria. It's now there are plenty of people I work with that are completely appropriate for antibiotics because of the severity of symptoms. But if we're talking about chronic, repeated small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, please consider looking into the inflammatory issues in the body. Please consider talking to a nutritionist or a dietitian about maybe doing periods of these herbal aids combined with dietary choices that can help reduce the bacterial growth and reset the system. So we do know that it's the low FODMAP diet is really the one out there when we're talking about bacteria because it reduces sugar intake, and oh my gosh, bacteria loves sugar. Sometimes I ask people who said they have sugar cravings all the time, does it feel like it's you, or does it feel like it's something living inside of you demanding that it needs sugar? There is actually a little bit of a feeling difference for some people, and they're like, oh my gosh, no, like I need it. My body gets so mad. And that actually might be more of this bacterial problem. So low FODMAP approaches can be helpful. These are not long-term strategies though, right? Like we want to control the inflammation, we want to reset everything and move on. So please work with a specialist. But that's going to decrease the sugars that are going to feed the bacteria. Anti-candida diets as well. There is a bit of an overlap with bacteria and yeast. So that's why I say there's always other options. If that doesn't work, there's probably something else out there. Hang on, we probably have something for you. But anti-candida diets can be helpful for some individuals as well. Work with a provider again, because we don't want to take out too much. We just want to stabilize, right? So, and then the herbal aids, which can be done with these dietary approaches, right? It's It's really nice to have a thorough and more complete type of approach to things. Berberine and oregano, there are a lot of studies out there that show the efficacy behind berberine and oregano in controlling gut bacterial responses close to the level of antibiotics. Okay, there are other things out there as well that certain nutritionists, herbalists use to help control that sort of bacterial activity. So there might be other things, but that berberine and oregano are really the ones that have been used for quite some time. And I always say too, like if we're on the chronic side of things and this keeps repeating and you're just one of those people that when things slow down for you, bacteria builds up, then it might be an idea to talk to your medical team about berberine and oregano versus repeated antibiotic use, right? There's also FODMAP enzymes that are out there that you can take before meals that actually help reduce basically how those sugars are used and dispersed into the body. So it will reduce that activity. Okay, I'm not reading through all of these, but feel free to pause and look. Okay, there you're going to find discrepancies everywhere. Science, medical science especially, is all about proving and disproving everything so that we cover all grounds for all individuals out there. Like this works for some, it doesn't work for everybody. When we're talking about diet as well, there are some foods that are high in histamines, and we take them out, but they were good for something else. And then there's things that we put in because we think that they're good. Oh, but they're high in oxalates. This is very complicated, so please understand that's why we would want somebody to work with a nutritionist, is because we would like you to expand things rather than limit. So this is the list, yes, but it's not telling you to eat only these things and not others. Okay. The same with grains, dairy, and legumes as well. This is typically what is things that we want to focus on and things that we might want to avoid in a short term dietary approach that it depends on your provider, but we really shouldn't be doing AIP diets and things like that I've heard even people do it for years. And then I think we know it's not working, right? Okay, a little bit more of a list. Okay, moving on to histamines and mast cell issues. I know this is, I do think diet's very helpful for this, right? But mast cells are driven by so much more than just dietary contributions. Mast cells are driven by immune system responses, right? So this is a bit of a rabbit hole, but we might be able to help a little bit with histamine control in some individuals, based on what their experience is. So yes, we do have low histamine diets out there that might help stabilize mast cell reactions. Maybe it can control mediator response, specifically to the histamine part of it. There are plenty of other mediators out there, but histamine tends to be a problem for a lot of people. And if we don't have other options out there, reducing the amount of histamine that we're putting in could be something that helps the inflammation overall, right? So there are some people that this might be helpful for, maybe not all. It's important to understand that there is no such thing as a no histamine diet. Okay, so I know there's a lot of providers and patients out there too that are very, very strict in their approach, and some of them have to be, right? But I really think that, again, talk with somebody, bounce ideas off of them. How long is this going to last? Do you look like you're somebody that's very histamine sensitive? And there are ways for individuals to tell that, especially with your food reports from the past and how you respond to them, right? And maybe actually some testing as well. But not everybody needs to be on a very, very strict a low histamine diet, because there's histamine in everything, right? And the level varies. Like with fruit, the riper the fruit, the more histamine. So are you eating it on a good day, or is there too much histamine? Way too complicated for that. Mast cell activation syndrome and histamine intolerance is very different. So a person can have them both, but mast cell activation syndrome is really the bucket analogy. There's lots of things going into this, and histamine is one of them. So it could be helpful, right? Histamine intolerance is you have a histamine intolerance. You're really not great with histamine. So maybe you should be avoiding higher histamine foods. And notice I say higher histamine foods, not histamine, because again, we can't really avoid it all the time. It's natural in our body. We just maybe don't want to have a night where we're drinking a bottle of wine while eating pizza and finishing with a chocolate cake. Guilty, right? Like we've all done stuff like that. But especially not when we're feeling not well. We don't want to keep adding into that bucket, right? There are herbal and supplemental aids that are out there for histamine support. There's a ton of antihistamines that are herbal based. There's holy basil, there's neem, there's moringa. There's lots of things out there to talk to herbalists or nutritionists about. There's also DAO supplementation or cromolyn sodium that you can take before meals. So cromolyn sodium is a mast cell stabilizer. So I just usually tell people, hey, mast cell stabilizers help with the communication piece of it. If it helps with the communication piece and the reactivity, it's not necessarily helping with the symptoms, if that makes sense. So it's helping with the reactivity of things that your body encounters while you're taking it. So it's not like it says, the Krillman says, oh, hey, you didn't see how well I took care of that last, pizza that you ate. You could have had a way worse reaction, but you didn't. It's not going to tell you that. Mediator support, like you do just feel a reduce in that mediator overall. It's not the reactivity report part of it. It's the symptom part of it that you're feeling relief in. So chromin sodium might be under the radar, but it could help stabilize reactions over time, right? So if it doesn't seem like it's causing miracles, it doesn't mean that it's not working. It just means it's part of the equation. DAO supplementation is actually something that you would take before eating a meal that helps support DAO in the body, which reduces internal histamine reactions. So some people do that before meals, whether they're doing a lower histamine approach and they just really want to keep it low, like they're trying to stabilize all of it. It's somebody that's having really high levels of histamine reactions to lots of things and they can't figure it out. Right. So it's kind of a lot of different things it can be used for. But especially if you're having meal related reactivity or food related reactivity, the DAO supplementation may be helpful. You can look up online. I don't mean to make that face. I actually love learning about food and what's in it, right? But I think it's just so confusing when you look online and you look at histamine lists and you have a green, a yellow, a pink, a red section, and now you have no idea what you're supposed to eat. Is it only the green? Can I go into the yellow? Can I do the other ones ever again in my life? Again, histamine is in so much of what we put into our bodies that it depends on your case and your situation. Please talk to a provider, come up with a plan, and during your plan, it will be an experiment. And if it goes well, that's great, you have information. And if it doesn't go well, great, you also have information to now modify from what your results were, right? So I typically talk about what's on the higher histamine list of things that we should possibly be avoiding. And this is at least a conversation starter, because if somebody looks at this and they're like, this is literally every meal I eat, that might be the problem. We might have to make less adjustments. But if somebody looks at this and they say, I don't eat any of those things, we might have a lot of digging to do to see how we can support them if we think it's actual histamine, right? So it's a conversation starter with an individual. It's not prescriptive really as a protocol. You have to work with somebody that can help guide you through the nutrition part of it. We want to make sure that you're not taking out too much, that you're getting good quality foods in there too. Mold exposure is something to consider, right? And I bring this up during the dietary part because we have a lot of people that jump into the AIP diet. Now, the AIP diet is the anti-inflammatory protocol. And just like I said about medical science, you're going to find the good and bad in everything, just like foods. You can look up, and this is where you'll probably, maybe for those of you that have gone down this rabbit hole, have gone online or talked to a friend, and you think you have this great idea about a food or a supplement, and somebody tells you all the horrible things that come along with it. It's really person dependent. So we can't base everything off of what one potential reaction is. We have to base it off of what we think is the best for the individual. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about food because with mold exposure, because we talk about the AIP diet, and that takes like not all, right? Like we can't possibly do that, but most of the possible inflammatory reactions that you could have from food. And it leaves you with such a limited space of what you can eat, especially if you don't like the food that's on there. So with mold exposure, I want to bring this up because a lot of people that have, sorry, I shouldn't phrase it that way. Some people who have abnormal mast cell activity have a history of toxin exposure, viruses, or whatever it might be. And there is a certain dietary approach for each one of those things that could be more supportive. Let food be thy medicine, right? We want to support with food. So understanding if we're dealing with mold exposure, which could stimulate abnormal mast cell activity, doing a detox and reducing those inflammatory triggers can be really helpful, right? I don't like to call it an elimination type of diet because we're doing a detox, and during this detox we're going to take some things out because we don't want things to get confused for mold, basically. So the AIP diet, I don't think it's precise enough, and I think it might be too limiting for most people. Yes, there are some people, of course, that were really having difficulty figuring out what the heck is going on, and food might be very inflammatory for them. So sure, we can consider it. But considering mold specifically, like if we're thinking, hey, this is a mold toxin, then we want to reduce the things that might have mold content in them from the way that we store and produce our food, or that might be confused in the body for mold, right? So grains, coffee, basically anything that can be stored for a while. And just so people are aware, some of the grains and especially the coffee, that can be stored in humid areas before they're shipped off for packaging and exportation and things like that. So that's why we have higher mold content potentially in grains and coffee. Dried fruits, nuts, we tend to bring lots of things together in a humid space before we ship them out, and we might think that they are shelf-stable for a long time, but that can lead to building up things around it, right? When we talk about alcohol, this is actually how the fermentation process goes and what it's being stored in. So what they found is with alcohol, that beer, red wine, whiskey, and brandy, the way that these are actually made, there might be higher mold contents in some of these products. Now, what you'll see too is there are some companies out there that pay for mold testing. I see this with coffee companies. I don't see grains really doing it yet. That's tough. But and I haven't seen it too much with alcohol, although I feel like at some point somebody had said something to me. But some of these can be labeled and they're checked for mold spores, basically, for however the volume that they're looking at. Um, Processed meat, and this is where again it's like the aging that happens, right? And this is a problem with histamines too, is processed meat is not something that's like immediately packaged up and stored efficiently, depending on where all this is happening, and where it's prepared and how it's transported. So sometimes that actually can have a natural buildup of mold spores on it. And so, yes, you can actually shop more locally. It'll reduce the transport time that's happening. There are actually some places that will tell you the slaughter to freeze date, that will show you basically how long the meat was exposed for, which might help some people with dietary issues. But there are programs out there that do that. Corn is notorious for building up things, I'll just say, especially how we store it and transport it. And then just in the confusion that happens with the system, aged moldy cheeses and fungi, so mushrooms and truffles, they can be confused for mold. Obviously, moldy cheeses have mold on them, and some people don't think about that. But taking these things out during your mold detox as a dietary approach could be very helpful and more efficient for the detox of mold. And this is where, okay, cue circus music, and this is where I just want to prove that diet is individual to your presentation and what you need in your body, right? And I know that you'll see people going back and forth. No, this diet is better. That diet is better. If everybody were just vegan, the whole world would be better. Sometimes, but not always, right? So the vegan diet actually has been found to be helpful for fibromyalgia and rheumatoid arthritis, right? So it seems to help with orthopedic-y type pains, musculoskeletal problems. They just general weight loss diet seemed to help with osteoarthritis. And they thought maybe that was from the reduction of sugar and fat intake overall. So again, like we don't always exactly know what science is trying to prove to us, because it's not like it gives us all of the answers. It's just going to give us data, right? The vegan diet too, and also the vegetarian diet that help with general musculoskeletal pain. So maybe more of the orthopedic-y type things as well. Maybe that was actually just less inflammation, right? Less protein, sugar, carbohydrates, calorie intake. Maybe it was just a healthier approach overall. They didn't know. But maybe for some people, vegan, vegetarian diets actually help with musculoskeletal pain, right? Low FODMAP seem to help with fibromyalgia, might help balance the microbiome that could help with inflammation. Then we have the peptide diet, which could help with rheumatoid arthritis. Okay, so a lot of different things that may be helpful. It's really person dependent. I think these are good guides though, that, well, if you really can't beat the musculoskeletal pain, have you tried more of a vegan or vegetarian? And they're all experiments, right? If it doesn't work well for you, stop and you have good feedback to talk about with your provider. Okay, so I put this on this next slide because a lot of the previous slide talked about orthopedic type of pain, but considering neuropathic pain, so neurological pain, right? We actually have this other group of research that may support more of a protein-based approach, or fat and protein with low carbohydrate and keto diets might be more helpful for neurological pain, inflammation, sensitization that happens, might help with depression, migraine, neurodegenerative diseases, right? So maybe if you're having more neuropathic pain, maybe you need more protein, more healthy fats, right? So just to understand, this is not to give anybody ideas to go leave with today, but just to understand, hey, it depends on how you look at it. What are the symptoms that you're trying to get at? And then let's start to talk about food. And what do you tolerate? Okay, now let's talk more about food. So it's a conversation in trying to figure out how you can be helpful to somebody. Then, of course, because I have to throw this in there, right? And if you have neuropathic pain or neurological pain or the neurological phenotype of HEDS, address what led to the neuropathic pain issues like toxins, histamines. What are those things that are exacerbating the inflammatory response in the body that's not under control? And also diet can be helpful, but I'll always come back to that, like what's causing the inflammation, what's causing the irritation. We're going to have to work on that. And for a lot of people, it's actually not specifically diet, although diet can be helpful. And sure, there are plenty of people that probably would feel a lot better if they cleaned up dietary habits, but I can't tell you how many people by the time that they get to me, they've tried every diet in the books. You got to go back to why your system is making you consider dietary changes, right? Why did you get here? Why do you have inflammation? That's the important piece. Okay. Excuse me, digestive enzymes can be helpful to some people. So digestive enzymes will help you break down food. And I know there are a lot of people with motility issues that just have difficulty moving food through their system or digesting it or, absorption, things like that. Digestive enzymes might be helpful. Okay. There's a lot of different digestive enzymes, and this is where it gets a little bit confusing. Amylase, lipase, protease. There is some other common enzymes in the small intestine like lactase and sucrase, right? So there's a bunch of stuff, and what you'll usually find is supplementation that has a lot of them in there for you, which might be helpful for some people. And then there's others that it's really the less is more. They can't handle a whole lot being added to the system. So just as for my herbalism background, and this is not prescribing anything to anybody, please, but just understand that there's also this world of digestive enzymes that are food: ginger, artichoke, fennel, and bitters. So those are things to consider with your medical provider. If you feel like you are having issues in that digestive process, breaking things down, then ginger and artichoke actually are big ones that are found in a lot of supplements. And yes, you can get enzymes that are supplements that have like 3 or 4 things in it. It usually always has artichoke. You can also just get artichoke, right? Gastritis, so inflammation of the stomach, basically. I'm just going to give you some of my herbals. Again, this is not prescribing things to people, but just to understand, there's actually a lot of stuff that has been researched that might help gastritis for stomach pain. So peppermint, licorice, astragalus, aloe vera, marshmallow root, chamomile, ginger, fennel, boswellia. Just for a little bit of my background, I'm going to run through some of those for you. And so you can see how my brain works when I work with people. So peppermint might be good, especially if we're really thinking about like nausea and gastritis combined. Licorice is also an antiviral, so we want to be careful with that. I mean, it would be great, but sometimes we can cause like a Herx reaction. And I like to tell people it actually, if it makes you feel good or bad, it's probably the right thing, but we have to reapproach it if it's making you feel bad, right? Astragalus actually can help with neurological inflammation in some people. Aloe vera, from what I've seen, has 50-50 with people using it. They either love it or they hate it. And I know that there's a lot of people that preach about it, but just know everybody is unique. Marshmallow root, I've had more consistent feedback from individuals that they seem to like it. Chamomile is also a nervine, which means that it'll help calm the autonomic nervous system and help regulate it. Ginger is also, as we saw before, it's actually a helps with digestive enzymes, right? Prokinetic. Fennel is another one that's it's a lighter antiviral. And Boswellia has been used with joint pain for people, like autoimmune type of joint pain that can happen in individuals. So that's where talking to an herbalist or a naturopath or whoever it might be, well, which one would be good for you? Well, if you have neurological pain, then maybe we consider astragalus. Which one is best for your combination of what you're dealing with? The way that I like to talk about food is to think of it in a positive way first and hopefully forever. But to just switch the way that we are having the narrative around this, can we reconnect with food as a positive source for changing health with individuals? And then redefine the narrative of our own relationship with food, right? How can we empower you or other individuals in understanding that food can actually help if we find the right things? So this is just one of the ways that I look at it with people, and this is just my list. I'm not going to run through everything, but this is my general food list, like kind of the very superficial stuff that we know: vitamin C heavy foods for the DAO component for helping to build collagen and just supporting the immune system, quercetin rich foods that are mast cell stabilizers and can really stabilize the immune system response. And then foods that are high in antioxidants, so things that clean up the mess in the body, right? And obviously, working with people that have so many reactions to things, I give all of these lists and I say, look, if you can find one or two things that are on here that don't sound awful, that you'd be willing to eat each day, can we put something into your diet to work on the anti-inflammatory component supporting you in this way, rather than taking things out first? Can we do that, right? Okay. I'm not talking about the EDS protocols. They're not mine, right? They're very much owned by others out there. There are a number of protocols that are available, or lists, right? Nutrition lists that look at all of the possibilities that can come with EDS that might be present and will offer solutions for each one. Okay. So with that, remember, less can be more. Okay. We want to be precise rather than throwing spaghetti at the wall. If we can figure it out, right? Sometimes throwing the kitchen sink at somebody might not be helpful. Okay. We're talking about connective tissue. Those vitamins and supplements, all of it, they go to the connective tissue, which is our filter, to be dealt with your cells, and then your connective tissue has to find something to do with the leftovers, kind of that recycled material afterwards. And if it's having trouble already, then putting more things into the connective tissue is not necessarily the best idea. The best idea is to be precise with what somebody needs for their primary issues, right? Okay. What they did find with looking at patients with EDS is that there seems to be less protein that's being eaten, more carbohydrates, altered body mass index. They have no idea why. And they really said like, not sure about this. But they more than half of them were not meeting the recommended daily allowance for protein. And we do know that we need protein to maintain lean muscle mass, especially in hypocapnic states, which are basically difficulty with oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange. And I can tell you, in the world that I work in, this is quite common in EDS, is our ability to regulate gases and homeostasis. So we might need even more protein than a typical person that is our size and doesn't have a connective tissue disorder, right? In patients with fibromyalgia, the fat intake in these individuals were limited to 50 grams a day to be able to improve gas clearance. So just something to know that limiting fat might be helpful with gas control. It upregulates that reflex inhibition of the small bowel movement. Okay, so it just kind of it slows things down. Um, and in all of this, they did find that all of these individuals had a strict diet due to food sensitivities. So once again, to remind everybody, if we are talking about food changes and manipulation, please talk to somebody for guidance. Also, Can we switch to this to a more positive conversation first to improve our relationship with food and the power that food might have to actually help and heal us depending on what our symptoms are? And then also know that we can manipulate this through a lifetime, right? So just because I am on a mold detox approach right now, I might be on a SIBO thing in a couple of years, and then I might have to support myself, with a lower histamine for a while, whatever it might be. It's something that's constantly, it's evolvable for us, right? Okay. So I'm going to go through all of the things that are out there. There's research as well, right? So again, you are not a protocol. You are not a diagnosis. You are a person that needs somebody to hear their story, right? However, there's all these suggestions out there. You can take lots of vitamins. You can take vitamin C, vitamin K, vitamin D, calcium, magnesium, CoQ10, and zinc. It doesn't mean that it's going to help you, right? Why are you taking them? Could it be helpful for some? Sure. Not for others. Fiber might be helpful, right? It's going to increase stool frequency, but it might not change the consistency, is what they're finding. It might reduce diarrhea, though. Okay. So this is where, if that's one of your symptoms, this is something to consider. But if that's your main symptom, you don't necessarily have to take all those vitamins listed up above, right? So let's be precise first. Try one thing at a time if we can. Okay. Probiotics, so specifically lactobacillus and bifidobacterium, might help diarrhea again. So if that's more of a problem, and that really does, diarrhea seems to be more on the inflammatory side of things. So again, controlling bacteria might be super helpful. Prebiotics, so things that make good microbiota, to put those into the gut to have a stronger, healthy microbiome, are things like it's actually different sorts of sugars, right? So beans, garlic, unripe bananas. You can also look up prebiotics. They actually have supplemental prebiotics, and certain fruits and vegetables are as well. Okay. Antioxidants and fiber can promote good bacteria growth. Antioxidants are just wonderful. Can we eat them rather than supplementing, right? That was my antioxidant list that I had earlier. Avoid processed foods, refined carbohydrates, and meats high in salt and cured, right? So this is where, wait, if we're supposed to be eating more salt, why should we eat less salt? And this is really just the processing piece of it. So this is meats that are high in salt and that are cured. So it's the way that basically the chemical process happens that it's the processing of it. We want to avoid that part. You can still potentially, if you benefit from sodium, that might be helpful, but don't put it in your meat and have it, processed that way. Okay. But this is very important for anybody that's thinking about dietary changes. If you haven't started with the simple processed piece and refined carbohydrates, that processed sugar piece, start there. That's huge. You're going to have to get there if you have a connective tissue disorder at some point, because your gut is not made to put those things in it. I'm sorry. Avoiding artificial sweeteners for some individuals, right? That can cause gut inflammation. We don't need more. Can cause glucose intolerance and break down the GI barrier, which we already said that GI barrier is made out of connective tissue. Let's not make the connective tissue work any harder. Avoiding fructose and alcohol. So this is more from that microbiome piece. It can increase gut permeability when it's taken in higher quantities as well. Both of those things, very much alcohol too. And I'll be talking about alcohol in the future more specifically because it's also a neurotoxin, which, and I'm not anti-alcohol. It's actually one of the quickest things that works on bringing you into a parasympathetic state, right? For a lot of us that use it out there. But there are things that can work better and don't bring the inflammation with it. But alcohol it's really, really tough on a connective tissue body, especially the neurological tissue. And it really makes it difficult to repair after exposure. So whether it's chronic habitual or binge episodes, it can really wreak havoc on the system. Okay, I'm not reading through all of these. These are from, I believe it's the Doe article from a few years back about here's all the things you could take. Again, I do not believe in the kitchen sink approach. I believe in working on reducing inflammation first and then seeing what's still dysregulated, right? But one thing to note on here, that I don't talk about in other spaces is the magnesium piece. And just to know, for those out there that want this effect or do not want this effect, the magnesium oxalate and citrate both act more as a laxative when you take them in higher doses approaching 800 milligrams. So just remember that. Again, some people want that effect, some people don't, but you also shouldn't be on the magnesium oxalate or citrate at higher doses for prolonged periods of time, right? So we usually only stay at those higher doses for a few days and then come back down. Okay, so yes, this is part of the article that is out there that lists, and I think it's really helpful, right? Because it says, if you have this, this would be helpful. If you have SIBO, this is helpful. If you have, diarrhea, this is helpful. But not everybody has all the things. So these are just suggestions of, if you haven't considered, do you talk about with your medical provider, or if you're a medical provider, should you talk about this with an individual, right? Because you obviously don't want to be, for most people, on a FODMAP and a gluten-free diet at the same time. It's very difficult. Okay. And I'm pretty sure this is all the Doe article from 2021, I think it is. So again, it just, hey, what's your diagnosis? These are things that might help you. But again, we're not a diagnosis. So somebody has to sit down and assimilate this information with an individual and then create a minimal, maybe progressive plan to work into over time. Okay. The overall key is to be malleable. The diet should absolutely change with the individual's needs, right? Let food be thy medicine. And when we're talking about medicine, what are we using it for? Those needs could change with time. Okay. And then we have different things to look at when we're talking about diet. What's the steady diet that for this person on a healthy day, what would they need because of their genetics or their ancestry, or, what just do they like to eat? What do they have access to? What's their steady diet that they should be thinking about versus intentional diet treatment? Those are two very different things, right? And I think the problem is that a lot of individuals go to a medical provider when they need intentional treatment with food, and then they forget that their standard diet might look very, very different. Or the provider might forget to go back and evaluate that. Like, hey, I know that we've done low FODMAP, but we're getting better. So let's see what your body wants on any given day, right? We want to be precise and choose food based on the outcomes we're looking for. So same message, right? What are the symptoms that we're dealing with? What are the current food choices that are aligned with that? That's going to help us reduce those symptoms. Okay, that's how we should be using food and medicine and working with the people that are really listening to our stories, of what would be helpful, right? Not taking out, and we might have to take out. We definitely might have to take out, but what can we put back in? What are some other options? What's a better way to look at food in a positive way that we can use this and empower ourselves to use food for the benefit of our health? So to summarize, food choices should be based on the needs of the individual to improve symptoms. I know that there's protocols out there. You are not a protocol. You are not a diagnosis. You are an individual that is living with a diagnosis. And what that looks like in your condition or your presentation might look very different than somebody else's. And you should be treated unique as to what you're presenting with. Changing food plans should be intentional and precise based on the outcomes you're looking for. So again, what are your symptoms? What would you like to see as outcomes? What food would help you get there? And this is why we work with professionals, right? So yes, there are, like any other group of medical providers, there are some really good ones out there, and there are some that just don't get it, right? And with this, I think that there's a growing field of people who get it. Understanding the complexity when we're talking about multi-system dysfunction that's all connected and communicates with each other in connective tissue disorders is very confusing. So it is very hard to find somebody that understands this. And I've seen, and this is not giving anybody an idea of where to go. I apologize, but we don't have that yet. But you either find a person that listens to you and your story and knows how to positively work with food, to give you food options to help your health, or you find somebody that specializes in connective tissue disorders and or MCAS and dysautonomia, right? So they are out there. They're few and far between, but they are out there. And then there's this new reference that came out last year that just talks about the nutritional considerations for hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. It was more of a step back rather than here's a protocol. Here's all the things that you could do. It's really a step back from like, whoa, guys, we're dealing with a lot here. We should probably pause and take in the whole of the patient. So that's why I put that one on here, because I do appreciate it for the fact that they looked at a step back and really consider the patient and their presentation. And then the other references from what you saw put up in here regarding some of the research. Okay, so I hope you're feeling a little bit more empowered by food. It actually can be super helpful, and it's really unique to you and your presentation. But working with a professional is really important. Finding somebody that understands you and your body is really helpful, and that has more options for you. And that's the key. Can we find somebody that doesn't run out of options, or somebody that when they do run out of options, they have a better person for you? Um, but there's a lot of things that we can do with food, and find somebody that will help you work with food in that positive way, right? And also just remember that if food doesn't seem to be the thing, there might be something else driving this dysfunction that's going on, that if you work on that inflammatory response, then food reactions might calm down over time. Okay. So thanks for hanging in there for this one. I'm sure we'll break things down in the future, nitty gritties of some of these things for some extra detail, like on histamines and things like that. But just an overall idea of how you can use food, and also why we might want to take a step back from using food in an elimination sense, right? And please remember that diet and food treatment is very unique to the individual, right? And we can use it positively. All right. Thanks for hanging in there.